Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Vincent. I'm the Director of Demand Generation at Datashield. Thank you for joining our webinar this morning. This is our Vulnerability Management and Incident Response webinar featuring PlexTrac, one of Datashield's partners. So you're going to hear from Dave Norlin, our Head of Security Operations at Datashield today, and you're going to hear from DeCloss, who's the founder of PlexTrac, and we're going to dive into these topics. Before we get there, a little bit more about who Datashield and PlexTrac is. So Datashield's been around for over a decade, one of the leading cybersecurity firms in the space, really provide a level of additional support for understaffed security teams, focusing in on managed detection and response, but also in endpoint protection and response, and of course, vulnerability management. PlexTrac really helps escalate and improve the remediation lifecycle with an organization. And they also provide deep insight with metrics so that you can figure out how your security program is trending. Overall, they're a platform that really helps the entire security management lifecycle within an organization. So for today, we've covered the company overviews. We're going to get in, and Dan's going to talk a little bit more about the need for vulnerability management. Dave will then talk about incident response, and we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Dan, and he'll talk a little bit more about the need for vulnerability management.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and thanks everybody for joining, and thanks for Datashield for hosting this. We're excited to talk a little bit more about the need for vulnerability management, the vulnerability management lifecycle, and the tools and processes that need to be in place to make that vulnerability management lifecycle successful. Vulnerability management is probably one of the most traditional aspects of cybersecurity. It's been around the longest, and there are numerous tools in place today to help you identify vulnerabilities. And then, really where the industry has headed is really getting into the full lifecycle capabilities for vulnerability management. So not just identifying the vulnerabilities, but being able to track those vulnerabilities to completion in terms of resolving the risk associated with those, whether those are a patch, whether they are a project that needs to be implemented for secure configuration. So that's the real goal, and vulnerability management really is one of the things that needs to be in place early on when you're building out a security program. So we'll talk a little bit about the different phases of a vulnerability, the life cycle that a vulnerability will take. So first off, risk is identified, in multiple ways, right? And so a vulnerability is a risk just like any other risk in an organization. So one of the first things that you need to have in place to be able to have a solid vulnerability management program in your overall security program is the ability to identify vulnerabilities. You can either do this in-house or use a trusted third party, someone like Datashield, to help identify the vulnerabilities within your organization. This is commonly done through network scanning and through vulnerability scanning engines, platforms such as Tenable, Nessus, so to speak, will identify vulnerabilities that exist on the network, right? As well as your external exposure to vulnerabilities through various scanning techniques. Tenable is one of the longest or the oldest vulnerability scanners on the market today, so they have a lot of experience in identifying ways to not only scan networks but find vulnerabilities on those networks. And so really part of that identification phase is to be able to establish kind of what your baseline is and then be able to show progress over time. So you can identify the vulnerabilities within your environment through a scanning service, and that you continue to do this regularly. So you start to see the trends of how often the same vulnerabilities are being identified, and even down to the asset level. So an asset being a host or a web application. And this really allows you to start to recognize the deviations or gaps in your security posture, and as well as your patch management lifecycle. So the way to identify risk is to start to say, okay, the vulnerability scanner is going to come in and identify that we have these vulnerabilities. The one thing that the scanner is not going to provide for you is the context of that vulnerability within your environment. Vulnerability scanners today kind of, they appeal with the common vulnerability scoring system, what we call the CVSS, but that's kind of a universal scoring system. So when a scan results come into your environment, it may recognize a vulnerability as a medium, low, high, critical, based on the CVSS score that that scanner has identified that is just kind of the overall standard for that vulnerability. Then it's what you really need to do internally is to determine, is that the actual risk that this poses to the organization? So if you're in a classified environment, say, where your systems are, air gapped from the internet, then the risks might be a little bit lower than a system that's sitting out in a public DMZ and is fully exposed to the internet. So that's where the engineers and the analysts really need to come into play and be able to help communicate the effective risk of this vulnerability. And that's something where a third party can definitely help you as well. Somebody that you've trusted, like a Datashield, to be able to say, hey, we are partners with you. We know your environment. So we've established this kind of risk baseline based on the types of findings that our scanners are identifying. You can change those scores over time. And ultimately, as you start to collect this information, you start to get a good perspective of your overall risk. So where PlexTrac comes into play is like we help aggregate those vulnerabilities from multiple sources, right? So whether you're using one or multiple vulnerability scanners, whether you're using network-based vulnerability scanners or application security vulnerability scanners, PlexTrac can aggregate all that data into one location so that you now have a global view of the vulnerabilities that have been identified in your environment, including things like risk assessments and penetration tests. So once we've moved on from vulnerability identification, what are we supposed to do with those results, right? So like I was kind of mentioning before, you have to put the context into your environment. And so what the scanner might have recognized as a medium vulnerability, you can begin to aggregate that with other information from other risk sources within your environment and be able to identify, like, this vulnerability actually needs to be higher in the list of a prioritization perspective because it's been affected by certain specific assets, or it sits in a different network that doesn't have as much access controls placed around it. Or if you're a PCI regulated environment, these assets that these vulnerabilities were identified with sit inside the cardholder data environment. So you need to make sure that those have a higher level of prioritization. So the nice thing about a platform like PlexTrac and with a third-party vendor like Datashield, they can come in and help you prioritize these issues, collect the data from multiple sources, and then you have a living risk register, so to speak, that you can now begin to say, hey, we're going to assign different risks to these vulnerabilities as they come in. We're going to make sure that the right people are assigned to go and fix them. And now we can continue to identify which risks are the most important ones to be working on, through this collaborative nature and a good partnership. So that's the next step in not just getting the data, but then starting to figure out what you're supposed to do with this. You get the data, you start to identify what does this mean in the context of our environment, and then that begins your prioritization process. And that prioritization process needs to be revisited multiple times, not just once, because a year from now, if you're getting the same identified findings from the same vulnerability scans on the same assets, something is broken in the process, right? So you might need to actually reprioritize some issues or change your process as you start to identify the gaps that might be existing in the current process. So prioritization is a really important part, and this is really an important piece of the puzzle from putting it into the context of your environment, which a lot of vulnerability scanners just can't do, and this is the value of being able to aggregate that data, as well as being able to look at the different risks across your environment as well. Okay, so now that we've gotten prioritization of the issues that have been identified, then we need to actually proceed to remediate the risk. So in this process, this is where the value of having a centralized platform and a trusted third party really makes sense. So if you don't have the expertise in-house to be able to say, hey, how are we supposed to fix this? Third party can come along and say, here are the ways that we've seen this work in the past. And so true collaboration across the entire remediation lifecycle is critical to moving the needle forward in terms of getting to a better security posture. So you can, within PlexTrac specifically, you can assign issues to different users. You can have them provide status updates on when these items are supposed to be fixed. You can assign issues at a per asset level so that for a specific vulnerability, if you have 10 assets affected by that, you could even see that there might be 10 different people assigned to resolving the issue for that specific asset. So it's also valuable to be able to see this historical record over time as well. So being able to see how you collaborated with your third party like Datashield, as well as being able to see how your internal team was able to collaborate and fix the issues. So the critical piece in the vulnerability management lifecycle is not just identifying that you have a problem, but actually fixing it and being able to collaborate effectively and quickly, eliminating spreadsheets and eliminating a lot of tracking systems that don't necessarily grab the whole picture of your security posture, where at the end you actually have to draw metrics out of those disparate systems to be able to truly report on how you've made progress over the lifespan of that vulnerability or that set of vulnerabilities. So being able to work together not only on your internal team, but with your external service provider and any outside consultants that might be coming in. If you have routine penetration testing from additional third parties, they can come in and provide the reports straight in PlexTrac. So now you can marry the reports that are coming in from the outside to the vulnerabilities that have been identified in your environment, and you start to get the global picture of your risk over time. So collaboration is a really important piece of the puzzle to an effective vulnerability management lifecycle. So once we've collaborated, we hopefully are starting to now see the trend that we're fixing more issues than are being reported. And that's where analytics comes into play. Being able to have real-time progress visualized to the stakeholders that are investing in your security program is vital, right? You want to be able to show accurate information around how much progress you're making in this vulnerability management lifecycle. And it also helps to identify the different gaps. So maybe you've tagged specific findings or specific assets, and you're able to show that you can make good progress on fixing the really critical assets, but you now need to focus your processes on the less critical assets or assets in a specific data center, or maybe cloud applications that you've custom written are not getting as, maybe their trends are not showing as much progress as your network-based assets. So the analytics is a key feature and a key value to you who, as users of PlexTrac and Datashield service, is that you have now visualization and trending over time. And so with the analytics modules, you can now see how much progress you're making, how quickly things are getting resolved, and what areas you need to focus on for improvement moving forward. And this begins to be your attestation of the actual security progress in your security posture that you're making throughout the life cycle of your whole vulnerability management program. So I know that was really quick, but that's kind of the gist of the different phases of a security vulnerability and in a vulnerability management program. So I will now turn it back over to kind of discuss how the incident response capabilities marry nicely with the vulnerability management service.
All right, thanks, Dan. So really at Datashield, what we're trying to do is provide context. And I think in a lot of ways, anyone who specializes in either providing SOC service or incident response is always in search of this elusive context. Everyone wants more context and more information within their vulnerability assessments or within their IR activities or just alerting in general. And I think, one of the ways that DataShield can do that is with some kind of vulnerability management service, leveraging the tool set in PlexTrac. And it really fits within this larger ecosystem of products on the whole. And every one of these is kind of filling that specific niche. And overall, the goal is to improve security posture through that. So when we look at the kind of things that DataShield does, every tool is meant to fulfill a certain purpose. EDR, you're getting the host-based visibility. With something like a Code 42 or Digital Shadows, you're kind of getting that insider threat perspective. With email security, we're looking at the most common vector for attack against an organization. With the SIM, you're really that's the place to bring all that information together and then collect it and normalize it and make it useful through correlation, and vulnerability management and the data you get from that is a huge part of it. So when we talk about vulnerability management, one of the most important things is just having that data, like I mentioned, and it makes analysis and incident response a little more clear. You kind of clear out the fog of war, so to speak, in that very tense situation, because you know where your actual risk is, and being able to see that risk compared to actual data, whether it's packets or logs or some other type of data source, is extremely powerful. So if you're able to, perhaps in the heat of the moment, you have a severe incident and you're needing to analyze that information in a quick way and an efficient way, then if you're able to filter everything based on that vulnerability information and say, okay, I'm only concerned about the systems that I know that are vulnerable, and indeed I don't see any suspicious activity reaching those systems, and you can kind of rest easy. You can save the time and money and manpower by avoiding unnecessary incident response. Or on the other side of the coin, if you do see malicious activity hitting one of those vulnerable systems, then you can spin up things very rapidly. You have the confidence in your decision and kind of get the wheels in motion. And maybe you need to explain to somebody, hey, here's the red flag. Here is it, we have great confidence knowing that this activity has actually been successful, or it's affecting a system that is vulnerable and could potentially be affected by this type of activity. So DataShield, we have a lot of expertise. We have people who have been doing security at a large scale for a very long time, and really, there's varying tiers of this, and we start from the more seasoned analyst all the way up to someone who has been doing security for basically their entire career. And to be an analyst at DataShield, we expect someone who is a little bit above average in terms of their security intuition, their abilities, and their knowledge. And a lot of times that comes from a DoD background, someone who has seen security in a very regimented, sometimes legal compliance background, and has been forced to comply with certain regulations and can do so proficiently. And that's something that carries over well to the type of 24/7 SOC operation that, that's what DataShield is. It's a very regimented security facility, and we have a lot of capability and tools, and are able to put the people behind it. So when we talk about our vulnerability management tool set, we prefer to work with Tenable and Nessus. We really see those as kind of two sides of the same coin. One, you're focused more on the agent side, whereas with the Nessus, that's more of the traditional type of scanner. And when you compare that, when you marry that up with PlexTrac, you get a very capable discovery and then lifecycle management toolkit, and being able to integrate that data again with the SIM, kind of the unseen component of this. You have the full visibility on your vulnerability and lifecycle management. You can not only get the information very effectively, but you can, as Dan said, actually act on it and track it and kind of build this risk register. And then the end benefit, the unseen side, is having it in the SIM and just being able to enrich your existing data with it. So DataShield is going to take on this burden. I started in vulnerability management. It was one of the more interesting ways to enter security, oftentimes very stressful and difficult to kind of wrap your head around if you're new to security. But DataShield's entire goal, our aim with this, is to make that process easier, to take the headache out of trying to discover the vulnerabilities and then devising a system of how to track the life cycle. All that is built into the service. It's something that DataShield's going to manage. We'll do the scanning, and then those results, you're not going to have to worry about seeing them in PlexTrac. We're going to handle all the upload. We'll handle the reporting of it. We'll work with you to identify your critical assets and understand, where are your organization's crown jewels? What do you need to be most concerned about? And then the reporting you get from the service is taking all that into account. It's not just dumping a 150, 200-page document on your desk and saying, here, sysadmin, go remediate these. It's here's what you actually need to worry about this month or this week, and then making the most out of your time, being able to direct your efforts at what makes sense from a business and an operational perspective. And then lastly, we've got kind of the core competencies of DataShield, and that's, like I've mentioned, we're able to discover, provide you the information, and then lastly integrate it. And it's the full loop. There's no link in the chain that is left off on its own. We think that security, it all comes together under the same umbrella. If you don't have that kind of data normalization and the analysis to go with it, and then integrations between tools, then really you're doing it wrong. You're wasting time, and you're not able to be as efficient as you would otherwise. So that's really what DataShield is here for when we come to this service, is being able to make the most out of the data. All right, do we have any questions?
Dave, thanks for that. I appreciate it. Wanted to open it up to the floor of our attendees for any questions. You can feel free to chat them in the Q&A box or raise your hand if you want to voice your question. I'll give everyone a second. Okay, looks like I have one here for Dan. Dan, how do you collaborate within the platform?
Yeah, so the nice thing about being able to have those findings all together is that you have the current status of like open, in process, or closed for a specific vulnerability. And so you can make status updates by selecting the button to say, hey, I want to provide a status update. And from there, you can ask a question. You can assign an issue to a specific user. So if you're say you want to collaborate with someone like David on like, I don't know where I'm supposed to fix this, you could assign it to him, make a comment saying like, David, how do I fix this? And then David can go straight into the finding and say like, well, this is the common approach, I think, for your environment, because this is the value of having like a trusted third party like DataShield, and their expertise is that they have the exposure to multiple environments, so they can come in and say like, well, for your environment, we think you should do it in XYZ fashion. So it's all done straight in the platform, and then he can assign it back to the user that asked the question, or keep it in his name until he wanted to provide more information. So it makes it really nice to be able to see in real time on a specific vulnerability the history. You start to get this timeline view of all the different comments and activities that have been conducted specific to that vulnerability.
Thanks, Dan. We've got another one in chat here. This is for DataShield, for Dave. What other tools would you recommend that supplement VM IR program?
Well, in terms of a discovery perspective, we work with a lot of different discovery mechanisms. That would be anything from Nessus and Tenable to Rapid7, Qualys, those types of tools. And then also I would say a good endpoint tool, because a lot of times you can get these indications from other types of tools that maybe do network monitoring or are ingesting logs. But from an IR perspective, you really want to see what's going on the endpoint. And if you have vulnerability information on one screen, you can see what's going on the endpoint on the other, then you can very effectively get this kind of complete picture of what's going on and what you need to do. So having an endpoint visibility, I think, is really crucial.
Thanks, Dave. Any more questions in the chat, or anybody want to voice their question? All right. Well, that'll conclude the webinar for today. Appreciate everybody joining, and I'll catch you guys next time. Make sure to sub for our webinar series at datashieldprotect.com. Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Always a pleasure.
Thanks.